Hello there everyone, welcome to the channel if you're new, welcome back if you aren't, I'm EDJ, and I'm trying an experiment right now. I currently have my air on because as I'm recording this, it's summer, you know, final day of June, and quite frankly, it gets hot here in California. So, yeah, I have my air in the background. I put on the noise removal on my microphone and some of the editing, so hopefully you won't hear it too much where it'll be distracting for all of you. Um, we'll see, because, either that or I'm just gonna have to sit in my room as I've been doing for a while and burning. But, yeah, either way, point is, we are going to be looking at a Historymarche video. A two-parter about Napoleon. This is the only other Napoleon videos I could find he's ever covered other than the Waterloo one. And, yeah, we're gonna be learning about Napoleon's strategy in Russia. So, the whole Russian ordeal that Napoleon got himself in, I think what's the, what's the most unfortunate part about it is how it didn't have to happen. The thing is like Napoleon and Tsar Alexander were for a while their allies, and if you believe, you know, they were very close, and so yeah, it's amazing how Napoleon managed to alienate two allies from Russia to Spain. And there are several things Napoleon did to upset Russia, such as the Duchy of Warsaw. Apparently I was reading up that when he married an Austrian woman, that, this upset Tsar Alexander, because I think there were talks of Napoleon marrying a Russian woman. I don't know if he ever intended to let that happen, but still, the Tsar took offense to that. And most importantly, I think, is the continental system, which did not do Russia's economy any favors. So, all these factors kind of piled onto, the Tsar and Russia once again opening trade with Britain, and then resulting in Napoleon being like, all right, well, I'm gonna go and, rough up, rough up Russia to get them back in line. So yeah, Napoleon, I think, in terms of, like, diplomacy and foreign affairs, wasn't the best at dealing with other nations, and I think the way he managed to ruin his alliance with Russia kind of is a good example of that. And, yeah, I think the thing is, I kind of would put the blame more on Napoleon as to why things went south with Russia. I feel like he had a bigger hand to play in why that all happened. And so, from what I'm understanding, from what I remember from the Epic History TV Napoleon series, that as he put it, essentially Napoleon was gonna go into Russia. I assume basically force them to once again adhere to the continental system, because he didn't want to be undermined, as he was in other places. And, so yeah, the thing is, Napoleon understood the seriousness of invading, Russia, so he assembled this massive army, 600,000 strong men, to go into Russia. And I think that's the only part of Napoleon's strategy that I agree with, in that, yeah, invading Russia is a very big endeavor, but from then on, Napoleon, it's a complete disaster. I think mainly because a lot of Napoleon's strategy relied on speed, maneuverability, and, not having to be hindered by things such as supply lines, right, or wagons. So the thing is, Napoleon assembled this huge army. He essentially lost his speed. He couldn't move as quickly as he normally could with the Grand Armée. And, since Russia was basically pulling away from facing the full army, and they were using the scorched earth tactics, resulted in Napoleon, being he's already slow with the big army, but then, having to rely on the supply lines, And just the overall logistics were a complete mess, and I think I remember some of the people he put in charge of certain sectors of this large army probably weren't ready to be in charge of such a big endeavor, such as I think one of his brothers, Jerome, who kind of missed a chance to attack or something like that. Like, you know, some of the people Napoleon put in charge probably weren't ready to be in charge of such an important invasion. So overall, I think it was just a logistical problem, and as we know, in terms of the logistics problem, him going through the scorching summer caused a lot of, like, death, sickness, illness, desertion, and by the time he even got to Borodino, he only had, like, what, 100,000 men? He lost, like, so many men, and then, from then on, his strategy in Borodino was interesting, too. Because all he did was just charge, you know, there was no flankings, nothing fancy, just a full-on fight, whoever, like, overpower who, and that resulted in a lot of death, and as we know, the Russian retreat in the winter. I'm spewing all this because I'm just kind of recapping everything, mainly to myself, recapping what happened, what I remember. It's been months since we covered his time in Russia, and yeah, it's just overall a complete catastrophe. It's one of the biggest disasters, I think, in military history, and it's all Napoleon's fault in a way, you know, like, completely, yeah, you know, it did not go well. So this goes to show, I named a lot of reasons, I think, why, things did not go hot in Russia. And I'm wondering how much of it I just got right, or how much of it Historymarche is about to, you know, say too. So, yeah, I don't really have much else to add, other than if you want to watch the original video, link is down below. With that said, let us watch How Did It Fail? Napoleon's Strategy in Russia, Part 1.
On June 24th, 1812, the French Emperor Napoleon led 450,000 men across the Niemen River into Russia, beginning one of the most notorious military disasters in history. Throughout this 6-month campaign, both French and Russian commanders would struggle with forces far greater than any army: politics, logistics, and of course, nature. In 1805 and 1806, Napoleon crushed the armies of Austria and Prussia, extending the French Empire over much of Western Europe. Part of his success came because the Russian army started far from the theater of war and could not reinforce the Germans in time. When Napoleon finally faced the Russians in 1807, the results were much less one-sided. Eylau was a draw fought in atrocious winter conditions, while at Friedland the Russians, while badly defeated, successfully withdrew back to the border. Nevertheless, the battles convinced the Russian Tsar Alexander to ask for peace. The resulting treaties of Tilsit carved up continental Europe between Napoleon and Alexander. France would dominate Central and Western Europe. Russia would have a free hand in the East. Both pledged to defend the new order against the overseas enemy, Great Britain, and accordingly, Russia joined France's continental system, under which it would stop all trade with Britain as a form of economic warfare. Despite this, neither side really accepted the other's hegemony. Alexander still expected Napoleon's empire to eventually collapse, and had no interest in helping him solidify it. When Austria fought France again in 1809, the Tsar would only give token support. In turn, neither was Napoleon ready to grant Russian desires in either Poland or the Balkans. But the chief irritant in the relationship would be Alexander's increasing reluctance to abide by the continental system. As Britain was Russia's chief export market, the Tsar's embargo had done considerable damage to his own economy, which only added to the anti-Napoleonic sentiment amongst the Russian aristocracy. In late 1810, Alexander finally gave in and resumed trade with Britain under quote-unquote neutral shipping. Napoleon's response was to begin preparing for war, and when this failed to deter Alexander, finally committing to it in mid-1811, the stage was set for the Emperor's greatest challenge yet. This video is sponsored by Bloodlines, Heroes of Lethus. Bloodline Heroes of Lethus is a hitting October.
Yeah, Napoleon had a very aggressive reaction to the Russia not abiding by the continental system, which, by the way, like I said, I'm more sympathetic personally in this conflict to the Russians, because I feel like, I almost wonder why anyone would want to be Napoleon's ally. Like I said, Napoleon with his allies are, between Spain and Russia, he didn't really help them much. At least, he kind of ended up screwing them over, right? I think with Spain, the way he basically usurped their government and handled that situation was a mess. And, with Russia, like I said, I think the big thing was the economy, right? Like, the continental system was not helping anyone, and it was just kind of ruining the economy, and it's like, them choosing to go back to trading with Britain is sound, right? Like, you gotta do what you gotta do for your own nation, Like I said, and I think Napoleon's response, I think he made this a really aggressive response. Again, I don't have anything backing this up. I just think he was upset at being undermined first by, certain people, like the way Spain was actually handling themselves against the Grand Armée, even if it was through military guerrilla warfare. Point is, I think Napoleon was feeling undermined, and so this huge army he assembled, I think he mainly did it to show everyone else, look at my strength, this is what happens when you don't, listen to me. I think this was kind of Napoleon trying to show off his strength and make an example out of someone to show that he's still the top dog. Again, that's just, I don't have anything backing that up, that's just kind of how I interpreted. I could be wrong, but, that's what I think. And, if war with Russia, and from what I get, is that Russia opens up the economy, and I never hear that they're the ones who declared the war, or, I don't know, I just think, as we know from history, invading Russia is a really bad idea, because it never works out. Like, when we look at World War II, right, Hitler assembling an even larger army to invade Russia, and it ended up, the USSR ended up basically doing a lot of the heavy lifting and taking out the Nazis, on mainland Europe. It's, yeah, so I'm like, maybe instead of invading Russia, you may have wanted to let them come to you, like before. That seems like the best way to fight, like, though I have heard that apparently the Huns were probably the only group to invade Russia successfully, but I also heard it was a smaller Russia or something. I don't know the full story behind it, but I heard that, well, actually the Huns successfully invaded Russia, so I'm like, I guess it's possible, but I don't know. I don't know the full situation, I just remember hearing something like that. But yeah, if there was going to be war, and if Russia was going to mobilize and attack Napoleon, probably would have been better for Napoleon to not face them on their home turf, I think. But then again, this is just all hindsight speaking. Obviously, at the moment, Napoleon is basically the master of Europe. you know, has the biggest army. He has a lot of reasons to be confident. Obviously, I'm just speaking from a place of hindsight, right? Like, you know, maybe, like, if at this point in history, without knowing what we know, it'd be easier to kind of be rooting for Napoleon, because you think, oh man, Napoleon with that huge army, you kidding me? He's gonna dominate. He's about to kick Russia's butt, and then like, oh. I think even Napoleon and everyone thought that, right? Or at least it could look like that. I don't know. Like I said, I'm speaking from hindsight. Obviously, Napoleon doesn't know everything we do, but, you know.
Napoleon's goals were deceptively limited on the surface. He simply wanted Russia to rejoin his continental system. But that meant forcing the Tsar to accept a deeply unpopular policy. So Napoleon planned for a decisive campaign that would end Alexander's ability to resist him. Achieving such an outcome in the vast expanse of Russia would be a formidable task. Seeking inspiration from history, Napoleon studied the records of the last great invasion of Russia, led by Sweden's Charles XII from 1707 to 1709. Charles initially invaded Poland with 44,000 battle-hardened Swedes, hoping to destroy Russia's main army there. At the time, Sweden was known for mounting rapid, long-distance strikes that were sustained by its army living off the land as it went. In this way, Charles hoped to outmaneuver, trap, and destroy the Russians. Instead, the Russians repeatedly withdrew ahead of Swedish maneuvers, scorching the earth in their wake to deny fire.
Isn't this what they essentially do to Napoleon, though? The scorched earth pulling back? Huh. That's funny. Napoleon taking inspiration, and it seems like history repeats, huh?
Courage to the Swedes. After months of this, the Swedes were lured deep into modern Belarus, their numbers halved by starvation, disease, and the need to garrison captured territory. Charles had hoped to aim for Russia's capital, Moscow, where Russia's army would surely have had to confront him. But now he was forced to abandon the chase, call in reinforcements, and focus on finding supplies. And that was when the Russians struck. They scattered Charles's reinforcements, harassed his army, and lured the Swedes even further into modern Ukraine. At Poltava, Charles's force was finally confronted by a Russian force twice its size, and the result was Swedish annihilation.
That is interesting. I did not know that. But that kind of seems what happens exactly to Napoleon. Wow. Huh.
Charles's misadventure taught Napoleon several things. First, Napoleon largely followed the Swedish invasion route through Belarus, which isn't surprising considering the sparse infrastructure there. And although Moscow was no longer Russia's capital by 1812, it was still of immense spiritual importance, and its central position would allow for additional options towards Russia's actual capital of St. Petersburg, or its breadbasket of Ukraine. Second, Napoleon agreed with Charles that the Russian army was key to the Tsar's resistance, and its destruction would win the war. But as shown, the Russians were unlikely to fall for Napoleon's preferred tactics of outmaneuver and entrapment, which would give the French an easy win on the cheap. Brute frontal assaults might well be needed to get the Russians to fight. Third, given the high possibility that the Russians would lure him deep into their territory, Napoleon needed an army that would absorb the inevitable attrition, provide detachments to hold the flanks, and still be large enough to fight a battle under reasonable odds. Accordingly, the Emperor increased the draft, diluted the officer ranks, and called on his German, Italian, and Polish allies to provide troops. The result was a 600,000-strong Grande Armée, the largest Napoleon had ever led, even if its quality left much to be desired, especially in the infantry arm. And finally, fourth, a supply system was needed to invade Russia, especially for an army of this size. But by 1812, the French had long since ditched the pre-revolution supply system, replacing it with extensive foraging as the army went. Like Sweden a century before, forage gave French armies extensive reach and speed. demonstrated in 1809 when tens of thousands smoothly redeployed from Spain to Austria. But Russia was far less densely populated than Western Europe. In particular, the expected theater of war, modern Lithuania and Belarus, only had about 1 million people in an area slightly smaller than modern France. Even without the inevitable Russian scorched earth tactics, the local region clearly couldn't sustain an army numbering half its population. Napoleon therefore returned to the pre-revolution supply system. He assembled thousands of wagons, barges, and animals, grouped into 26 transport battalions. Some would establish depots in the army's rear. Others would travel from these depots to troops on the front line. In this way, Napoleon hoped to maintain a reasonable supply level as he advanced.
Join large-scale battles with military vehicles. The online action game War Thunder has received a major...
In hindsight, some of these preparations were insufficient. The wagons were not designed for Russia's often muddy roads, and only the worst soldiers were assigned to this low-prestige work. But more importantly, Napoleon failed to adjust his operational method to the new logistics reality. Pre-revolution generals limited themselves to slow, methodical, limited campaigns because they knew how unreliable their supply systems could be. By contrast, Napoleon still hoped to conduct post-revolution, aggressive, long-distance maneuvers.
Ah, that makes so much more sense. Yeah, I always thought that he mainly did the supply lines. Well, yeah, the Russians do use scorched earth, I believe, in this invasion. But, yeah, this makes sense. He's using Napoleon, the way he goes, speed, right? But, you know, with this large army, plus he's using, you know, pre-revolution supply, he needed to, I guess, tweak it to fit the way he's working, and he didn't do that, so I could see the logic in some of Napoleon's preparation, but it's almost funny, just like, I'm thinking about the Charles of Sweden invasion that he just went over, and just how eerily similar it is to Napoleon's. It's like, Napoleon learned from that, tried to prep accordingly, and he ended up falling kind of almost into the same trap.
For all his preparations for an extensive invasion of Russia, Napoleon's ideal campaign remained one where the enemy fully cooperated with him, either by attacking Poland or staying near the border. Either would allow the French to trap and annihilate them in a month, and that outcome wasn't entirely unlikely, given what he knew of Russian strategy. Napoleon had advertised his war preparation in the hope of scaring Tsar Alexander, so the Russians had ample time to design their response. Since late 1810, the Russians were already disengaging from border wars, realigning with Britain, and subverting French hegemony in Germany. These initiatives bore fruit just before the invasion, as Russia made peace with Turkey, allied with Sweden and Britain, and got Austria to limit its contribution to the upcoming war. Reforms since 1805 had increased the effectiveness of Russian artillery and infantry, while its light and irregular Cossack cavalry were already the best in Europe. Mobilization efforts by 1812 yielded a 600,000-man army, including reserves, backed up by 1 million militia of varying quality. But the Russians lacked trained engineers to support a defense, and were further hampered by an inefficient command system, ridden by mutual suspicion, not just between the generals, but also between them and the Tsar. There were also broader constraints on Russian strategy. Russia's economy was in terrible shape, which the continental system only exacerbated. It could only get by through printing money, which caused its currency to depreciate by half over a decade. Even accounting for British subsidies and the low cost of Russian soldiers, the country couldn't maintain extensive mobilization for long. Added to this was the weak political position of Tsar Alexander. His father had been overthrown in a coup in 1801, and the British believed that they could do the same to him by destroying the Russian fleet. Napoleon certainly believed that capturing Moscow would force his surrender, and even Russian generals during the invasion felt entitled to demand the Tsar change ministers. As a result, the traditional Russian strategy was long-ranging offensive campaigns, which would both allow the Russian army to live off the enemy and fit with the cult of the offensive that characterized Russian military honor at the time. By contrast, letting the enemy spoil Russian lands was seen as an absolute humiliation. Up until 1812, Russia thought of striking the French in Poland first, with the help of a defecting Prussia. But as the true scale of Napoleon's army became known, though as a state secret it was known only to the Tsar, his war minister de Tolly, and their staff, it became clear that such an attack would play into Napoleon's hands. The emperor wanted a quick, decisive campaign. Everybody else, Prussian defectors, anti-Napoleon spies, and de Tolly, urged the Tsar to put up an extended defense. De Tolly drew up a strategy for Russian armies to withdraw past Belarus and Lithuania. They would take up new positions at forts before the borders of Russia proper, marked by the upper reaches of the Dvina and Dnieper rivers. The Grande Armée would be forced to march across and lay siege within poorly supplied territory, bleeding it dry and opening the way for a Russian counteroffensive. Until that point, nobody was to fight Napoleon and run the risk of destruction. This strategy was politically risky. Both de Tolly and the Tsar were already under suspicion for their prior alignment with France, Napoleonic-style reforms, and extensive use of ethnic non-Russians. So as war loomed, the Tsar began to emphasize his Russian credentials. Letting Napoleon march to Russia itself was one part of this. Alexander also replaced reformers with Russian conservatives, and made emotional pleas to the church and nobility. His efforts worked. While many aristocrats remained wary of the Tsar's government, they enthusiastically teamed up with Russian merchants to donate money, goods, and serfs to the war effort, eager to defend the motherland against whom the Orthodox Church deemed an antichrist. Even then, significant risks remained. Russian generals could still place military honor before de Tolly's strategy. Large sections of the Dvina-Dnieper line weren't and couldn't be fortified due to a lack of engineers, with the most the Russians had being fortified camps. And lastly, the Russians also needed Napoleon to cooperate. Should the emperor limit his appetite to merely advancing the borders of his Polish ally, then the Tsar would have simply given away territory for nothing. Here, the Russians could only hope that Napoleon's ambition would override his military sense. Even as the French gathered in East Prussia and Poland, they were already in logistical trouble. Wishing to preserve his rations and extend his campaign time, Napoleon had told the army to forage until the invasion began. But there wasn't enough to feed 600,000 men. And soon, dysentery and typhus outbreaks further added to the soldiers' misery. Nevertheless, by June 1812, Napoleon's Grande Armée had formed into three main groups. The Central Army, about 450,000 strong, a mostly Prussian corps guarding its northern flank, and a mostly Austrian corps further to the south. On the other side, the Russians were still repositioning their armies. Against France's northern corps stood the fortress of Riga, soon to be reinforced by the army of Finland, now freed from observing Sweden. Against the southern corps was the newly formed Third Army in western Ukraine, soon to be reinforced by the Danube Army, returning from the Turkish War. And finally, against Napoleon himself were two armies. First Army, with 125,000 men in Lithuania under de Tolly himself, and Second Army, with 50,000 in western Belarus under Bagration. The Grande Armée invaded Russia on June 24th, invading Lithuania in the hopes of trapping First Army around Vilnius. But almost immediately, supply problems began to slow the French offensive. Heavy rains and muddy roads trapped soldiers and wagons, and the French rear gradually fell behind. To avoid being dangerously strung out on the march, Napoleon had little choice but to order his vanguard to slow down the pursuit. In any case, Totoli was already withdrawing First Army to the Dvina, specifically the fortified camp of Drissa in northern Belarus. Originally, he had hoped to use Bagration's Second Army to strike at Napoleon's rear in Poland, but by now it was clear that the enemy was too large for that. Second Army was therefore asked to pull back and join First Army, but Bagration, who was not informed of the Grande Armée's true size, protested, and only an order from the Tsar could get him to move. In the meantime, Napoleon had slipped a 70,000 corps under Davout in between the two Russian armies.
Davout, Davout, Davout. Oh man, Davout, my favorite marshal. It's been a while since we've heard about him. So always happy to see my favorite marshal back. But yeah, it's just a comment because I've been a little quiet, just kind of learning. It was interesting learning about the Russian mindset that's going into this. You know, the mistrust, the situation with the Tsar, and how precarious of a situation the Tsar is among his standing with, you know, his fellow, I guess, his subjects. And you know, they're conjuring up this strategy, and like I said, I don't think it was their intention, or wait, no. Sorry, I might have to rewatch some things. But it is interesting that, like, he mentioned, you know, hoping that Napoleon's ambition outweighed his military sense. And you know what? In a weird way, that's kind of what happened, right? Like, those hopes from the Russians kind of came true. Because I feel like Napoleon, this undertaking is very ambitious, to put it lightly. You know, assembling the biggest army ever fielded, going into Russia, trying to complete destruction of the army, or at least to the point where the Tsar can no longer resist him. You know, very ambitious, as expected from Napoleon, but yeah, I do feel like I said, it's easy with hindsight, but yeah, Napoleon made some pretty big miscalculations that, you know, that kind of ruined him at this point, and him going further and further, essentially being led deeper into enemy territory. And I know he was going for Moscow, but, yeah, you know, there's a lot to it, but that part really interested me, you know.
Now 1 week into the invasion in early July, Napoleon decided to switch targets to Bagration instead. He ordered the corps directly facing Bagration, led by his brother Jerome, to pin Second Army down, while Davout maneuvered into its rear. It was soon obvious that Jerome, due to supply or incompetence, was failing to do this. But rather than personally supervise the action, the Emperor hatched a scheme to have Davout usurp Jerome's command. An angry Jerome quit the war, his corps ground to a halt, and Second Army escaped yet another French maneuver, though Davout continued to block its path towards First Army, as both forces moved across Belarus.
Yeah, that reminds me when we covered that in the Epic History TV. Another problem is, you know, obviously Napoleon's maneuvering, he's already lost the speed advantage that he normally has, right? Also, just some of the people who were working under him, like his brother, weren't able to completely do what he said. Whether supplies, from the Epic History TV telling, it just came across as incompetent, and I'm willing to kind of more lean to that thing. But either way, yeah, as you see, some of the people he has under him aren't able to pull off what he wants, which kind of goes, yeah, some of the management, at least with Jerome, probably wasn't ready for this. Like I said, I don't know how much experience Jerome has, or has had up to this point, but probably not enough to, do what Napoleon needed him to do. And he kind of just, yeah, there was a good chance, right, with here, but it was squandered, essentially.
Meanwhile, Dutoli had uneventfully withdrawn to Drissa, only to discover that the camp was utterly unsuitable as a place to wait out Napoleon. By mid-July, Dutoli decided to withdraw again, just in time to foil Napoleon's latest maneuver to entrap First Army. The Russians proceeded to Vitebsk in northeast Belarus, with the French shadowing them from the other side of the Dvina. The city basically marked the limit of Dutoli's Dvina-Dnieper line, and so at the end of July, First Army turned to make a stand here, hoping that Second Army would finally be able to join them. This was the decisive battle that Napoleon had been waiting for, and accordingly, his vanguard began skirmishing with the Russians as the Emperor brought up the rest of the army for action. It was not to be. Frustratingly, this time Napoleon was undone by Davout's actions further south, which had again blocked Bagration from moving north. As soon as Dutoli heard this, First Army immediately resumed its withdrawal to Smolensk on the Russian border. By now, the French had crossed the entirety of Lithuania and Belarus without much result, so the Emperor called a halt to operations in order to rest, reorganize, and take stock of events. If you stayed around this far,
yeah, and you're also seeing, it seems like the coordination is off from everyone. Jerome just quit the war. Imagine just quitting the war, like, okay, we're done. Yeah, it's just everything's a complete mess, huh? Yeah, I'm gonna jump to part 2 right now, so this was very interesting. I'll see you in part 2, everyone. Bye.